join us to talk about the building energy codes and really how you can comply with up to the highest level of the code. We're excited to talk through that. So we'll start with that for the first 45, 50 minutes or so. And then we are going to be joined later by the EOHLC team to talk about clean energy tax credits for nonprofits and how you can take advantage of them. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Mache, who will share the presentation on building energy code. And please, as you have questions, just put them in the chat and we will get to them during Q&A in about 30 minutes. So thank you all, and I'll turn it over to Mache.
Emily, can you see my screen? Can you see the presentation?
Not yet, but it may just take a lag.
Let's see about this one.
Yep, good.
All right, awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Maciej Konieczny. I work for New Ecology, and today I'm going to present on the landscape of energy codes in Massachusetts. It's not, comprehensive review of everything, but I hope you walk away from this sort of understanding what's happening in Massachusetts. So in sort of a quick summary of what we're going to talk about today, it's really hard to talk about today without really quickly jumping back for quick history lessons. How did we get here? We'll talk about how many codes, energy codes, there are in Massachusetts currently, and hint, it's more than 2. How do energy codes work? I'll go over sort of the process, how we arrive at a stretch code and the specialized code. And then I'll go into the stretch code, specialized opt-in code, and mention a few things about the existing building codes. All of this will be focused on multifamily. Codes are much, denser. And, of course, we could spend an hour just talking about one sentence in the code. So, sort of setting up the stage here. But it'll all be about multifamily, and then I'll finish off by just highlighting some mass save incentives that are changing this year and summarize what I hope we get out of this presentation. Again, my name is Maciej Konieczny. I work for New Ecology. Most of you are probably familiar with us. We're a nonprofit that specializes in affordable and high performance, affordable housing and high performance housing, with offices in Boston, Baltimore, and Wilmington. Okay, so I'm going to jump back for a second to 2008 and Green Communities Act of 2008, big legislative act. But I'm going to highlight 2 components that I think sort of build on, help me sort of frame the code situation right now. So one of the big requirements was that the Green Community Act required that the BBRS, which is the entity that's required for building codes in Massachusetts, adopt the latest edition of the energy code in Massachusetts. So those codes change every 3 years. So now instead of
they're not
having
they're putting the windows in the first. I was like,
I don't know, I'm hearing somebody speak, but okay. And now instead of changing every 5, 6 years, they will be changed every 3 years. So that was a big change. And then the other component was it created the stretch code, which probably everyone knows at this point. It's the ability for a local community to require a higher performance construction in their community. And there are about 300 of those communities now. And jumping all the way to 2021, there's the Climate Act of 2021. Again, big act of legislative act, but 3 components that help us here is 1, it set net zero greenhouse gas emission goals by 2050 with a requirement that we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 85% from 1990. It shifted the responsibility of the stretch code from BBRS, which is the Board of Building Regulations and Standards that is responsible for all building codes in Massachusetts, to DOER, which is the Department of Energy Resources. So Now the energy code is overseen by Department of Energy Resources, a little bit more aligned in their mission, and there's a big focus on electrification. And so, like I said, there are three codes, more than two, three codes. We have the base code, and every code in Massachusetts is based on the 2021 IECC. So there's the base code with Massachusetts amendments. Then there's the stretch code, which is sort of the base code with stretch code amendments. And then there's the specialized code, which is the stretch code with specialized appendices. So as of June 1, I think, is when I checked in on this. There are about 50 cities and towns in Massachusetts that are under the base energy code. There are about 257 cities and towns that are part of the stretch code. And there are 44 towns and cities that have already adopted the specialized opt-in code. Right. So while stretch code is updated automatically, so if you're a stretch code community, you have a code that you're already a stretch code, as the code changes from 2021 to 2024, et cetera, it'll be automatic. The specialized code must be voted in during a town meeting. So that will those numbers will continue to change, very likely. Here is where the current state of is. We have, like I said, about 44 towns in Massachusetts that have already adopted this. I highlighted sort of the biggest towns and cities because 44 might not seem like such a big number on first pass. If you really look at it, it's about 12% of communities, but it actually represents 35% of the population. So chances are you or your project will likely be in a community where the specialized code is going to be implemented, has been implemented, or is being under consideration. So it's a quick, in the last 2 years, it was a quick turnaround, quick turn and adoption. Okay. So, excuse me. So how do codes work in Massachusetts, right? So I already mentioned this, but I wanted to really lay out the landscape again. It's International Code Council is the entity that develops these codes. The international codes, sometimes called the I codes, there are 15 of them. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen, all 15. And, they're anything from building code to plumbing code, mechanical code, and so on. And these are updated every 3 years. And then the International Energy Conservation Code is the basis for all energy codes in Massachusetts. I've been mentioning this before, but when I say 2021 IECC, that's where it started. And then Massachusetts changes it through different amendments. And the quickest way to find this, if you type in is 780 CMR, that's the Massachusetts code. And those are where all the amendments will find. Let me just go quickly through and sort of repeat, but maybe more graphically of what I just said. So we start with the 2021 IECC. That's every 3 years that's going to be updated. So in a few years, that's going to be 2024, 2027, et cetera. And then BBRS makes amendments and we get the base code. For example, this is pulled from the draft. They added sections to the IECC. They added here in this case, in this example, they're adding section C4012, C4012, 24, etc. And here, what basically they're adding sections that say, yes, you're in a base code community, but you have the option of using other codes if you want to. So if you're a base code and you want to use the passive house pathway, you can. If you want to use the stretch code pathway, you can. That's basically what this example says, but imagine this for the entire code. Another one is how to, stretch code is very similar, except DOER makes those amendments. And here, again, as an example, I pulled it out. And what you see here is that Massachusetts, DOER, added an entire section of compliance pathways that are not in ICC. And here you can see there's the targeted performance pathway. Some of you may have heard that called TEDI. That's one. That's the TEDI pathway, and it also creates the passive house and HERS compliance pathways for residential buildings in the code. So now we started with 21 IECC, we added targeted performance pathway, we eliminated certain pathways for certain buildings, and we added this passive house. And then finally, we get the appendix. RC is for residential, CC is for commercial. And really, that's right there is the summary of everything. It's only for residential buildings, and it requires passive house certification. Really, there's of course more nuance to it, but if you really need to know one thing about specialized opt-in code, is that for residential buildings of certain sizes, you are required to now have a passive house certification, whether that's FIAS or PHI. If the code is neutral on this, but the requirement is that you will need to certify using one of those pathways. I pulled this slide from a DOAR presentation. I think it's like the cleanest way to really summarize where we are. Again, 3 codes: base code with modest modification and EV ready requirements. You go to stretch code with some significant modifications, EV ready, and then you have the specialized code with the same modifications, but adding passive house for multifamily, and then all electric and net zero requirements as well, and EV ready and solar ready. Okay, so that's sort of the lineup. Now I'm going to jump into a little bit more detail about each of the codes. Again, this is a very high level. I'm happy to answer more questions, any questions later, but okay. So when I talk about these codes, I'm really focusing on multifamily, especially on the commercial side. So take that note. But so for residential code, we really have a few pathways. There's the prescriptive pathway, which means, you have to follow, the building has to follow exactly the R values, the performance values of heat pumps that are listed in the code. It's sort of the typical pathway that you would do on a smaller building when you might not have an engineering team, but generally it's very prohibitive. It doesn't have flexibility, and you need to really follow strict rules. So most of the time, I don't see that happening with buildings of 3 stories and less, which is the residential story. There's of course the passive house as the pathway, which is I just mentioned. The new code still has the HERS index, but it has reduced it and has created 2 tiers. So now we have a mixed fuel tier, which requires a lower HERS score of 42, which is a very aggressive score, really. But if you really need to have domestic, hot water on gas for some reason, or some other gas in the building, you need to meet HERS 45. Or if you're all electric, you need to meet HERS, 42, and then you need to meet HERS 45. And again, with the HERS index, the lower the number, the higher the performance, right? It's the reference building is sort of 100, and then as you get lower and lower, is the relatively less energy is being used by the building. So 42 is higher performance than 45. And then, of course, even in a stretch code, you're always allowed to use the higher level code, so you can use the specialized opt-in code. And then 2 other points that are important. One is that residential code now requires energy recovery ventilation, so you will have to have an ERV or HRV. And it does require electrical vehicle readiness, which the big word here is that the buildings shall be wired as follows. In the past, it used to be that you can have your house panel with a space for a breaker, maybe a conduit, and call it a day. Now you have to have the breaker in place. You have to have the conduit. You have to have the wiring between the breaker and the end of the conduit. Pretty much everything has to be installed except the charging station itself. So sort of to motivate everyone to just do it, I guess. And so those are the number of spots, and you can never have fewer than one. So if you have a 3-unit building, you'd still need 1 spot, but otherwise 20% of the spots. So that's the residential high level. Now on the commercial side, right, just for all other buildings that are not part of the residential, and for us specifically, we're going to talk about the fact that all multifamily, there are 4 stories of higher. So the code divides it: residential, 3 stories and fewer, commercial, 4 stories and higher, right? So even though the commercial code does have a prescriptive path, you're not allowed to use that for residential buildings. So you cannot use a prescriptive path if you have a 4-story building or taller. There is the TEDI pathway. TEDI is, again, it's the thermal energy demand intensity. It's a way of making sure that the envelope and the ventilation are really high performance in a building. And the code requires that dormitories, fire and police stations, libraries, offices, schools, post office, and town halls must follow this TEDI pathway. And then it's open to other buildings as you want. So you could theoretically, for multifamily building, follow the TEDI pathway. Commercial code does have what's called relative performance pathway. It's sometimes known as the ASHRAE pathway. We're not allowed to use that for multifamily buildings. We're allowed to use this ASHRAE pathway for either what's called high ventilation buildings, which means that they're ventilated at more than 0.5 CFM per square foot, or any building that isn't listed in the TEDI, right? So, but we, for multifamily, are not allowed to use this pathway anymore. Again, passive house, not required under stretch code, but allowed for a residential building. HERS can be used as same values as I mentioned on the residential. And a big one little important component, I would say, that tenant spaces. So if you have 50-unit building and it has 10,000 square feet that's going to be retail, or it's going to be fitness center or something like that, that tenant space, educational center, whatever it might be, that in the past, that tenant could come in and install pretty much any piece of equipment they wanted. They could install the cheapest or the best, it didn't matter. Now the first tenant in the building must comply with the new construction requirements. So whether that space follows prescriptive path, TEDI path, whatever, when they fit out their space, they must meet the new energy code, which is a big change and an important one. Okay, moving on to, I know there's a lot of info, so take notes. Well, I'm happy to go back to any of these slides. So speaking of specialized code, again, 44 communities, 35% of population, the number is still growing. So what does that really mean? So first, it really applies only to residential buildings. It does not apply to any other commercial buildings, only residential, RU's buildings. And it creates 3 different pathways. It creates the zero energy pathway. It creates the which zero energy, for make sure we're on the same page, just means on an annualized basis, the building does not require additional energy from the grid or anywhere else, right? So when you do all the generation on site and all the consumption, at the end of the year, you arrive at 0. All electric pathway, just as it's described, and mixed fuel is the same. If you have any gas or any oil or anything else, propane in the building, that would be the mixed fuel. The big component of the specialized opt-in code can really be summarized right here, which means that multifamily buildings over 12,000 square feet must be certified, not certifiable, certified through Passive House, whether that's FIAS or PHI. The code is neutral on this, but it does need a certification. And then mixed fuel units greater than 4,000 square feet, really all about single family. Mostly this is for large single family buildings. They have to be have a HERS 0. This should say Passive House 0, which it says here. But so summarize, really, here we are, right? The first path, dwelling units up to 4,000 square feet. Really, I don't know if I've ever seen that large of a unit in a multifamily building that we work on, but essentially single family buildings just says that those buildings must either be all electric, then they have to meet HERS 45 or FIAS. So for Smaller buildings, you do not have to certify by Passive House, but you do have to have HERS 45. And again, for single family buildings that you want to have gas for whatever reason, it's the lower HERS score or FIAS, and everything has to be pre-wired, right? If you want to have a gas-fired furnace, then you also have to be wired for a future heat pump. If you want a gas-fired domestic hot water, then you also have to be wired for a heat pump, hot water heater, et cetera, et cetera. Or this is still sort of large buildings, really all single family, big mansions. If you're more than 4,000 square feet, you have to be fully electrified, and that's fine. If you're mixed fuel and more than 4,000 feet, you have to be HERS 0 or FIA 0, meaning you have to be a net zero. You have to follow this pathway, the zero energy pathway. And then finally, the multifamily, I already mentioned this, but there are two different pathways. Passive House certification is required. If you're all electric, you pretty much meet it. If you're mixed fuel, which Passive House does allow, you just have to pre-wire everything. So for multifamily buildings, 12,000 or bigger, even if you do have mixed fuel, you do not need to be HERS 0 or Passive House 0. You just need to be Passive House certified and pre-wired for electric. So, these days it's sort of going away, but for the past few years, electrifying the heating and cooling in multifamily is pretty straightforward. We've used VRF systems or heat pumps for a decade successfully, but the domestic hot water, people were on the fence for a while. We're seeing more and more of that. But for example, if you do need to, if you for whatever reason you decide to have a gas-fired domestic hot water in the building, that's fine under this code, under this specialized code, but you do have to pre-wire. So your electrical system has to have sufficient capacity. There has to be room in the panel. There has to be room for the storage. You have to be ready to electrify your domestic hot water, and the next cycle, whether that's 15 years or 20 years down the road. So again, specialized code just for RU's buildings. As far as multifamily, just require over 12,000 square feet requires Passive House certification. That's really the summary here. So existing buildings, there have been some significant changes too. So in the past, you may know that it's, if you touch it, you sort of bring it up to code with something like an envelope. When you might open a wall, really the requirement was only to fill that cavity, whatever the cavity might be. If it's 2 inches, if it's 4 inches, you just fill it and that would meet your requirement. So the big change under the stretch code is for large additions and level 3 alterations. So large additions basically means that if your addition is more than 1,000 square feet or doubles the size of the existing building, you have to meet these HERS scores. So you have to then meet your infiltration rates. You have to meet, all the equipment performance just for the addition. Just to be clear, just for the addition. And then level 3 alterations or change of use. So change of use really quickly just means, if there's all this talk now about changing offices to residential. So changing office to residential will be change of use, period. Like automatically you would have to comply with the entire building. Level 3 alterations, this is the definition of it. It just means if you're it's much more nuanced than this, but the basic premise is that if 50% of the area of the building is altered, then it becomes a level 3 alteration. That you definitely should talk to a code consultant specific to your project, because that work area, which I underlined, has its own definition. But basically, large renovation, level 3 alteration will require also that it meet that whatever is being renovated. So in this case, it could be the whole building, has to meet these new updated requirements. So that's on the residential. Again, 3 stories or fewer. On the commercial side, it's a little different, right? There is additions and alterations have the same definition. It's a little different because now you're allowed to follow the prescriptive path for a certain size. So up to 20,000 square feet, you can follow the prescriptive path. If you exceed those, then you have to actually go all the way to new code. And then for alterations, the same, prescriptive, with a big exception where you are no longer allowed to sort of open the cavity and fill it. Now, every time you touch something, you actually have to bring it all the way to the new code. So with the example of a wall again, you would unlikely be able to just open a cavity, fill it with insulation, and close it. You would actually have to either start adding exterior insulation to come up with the prescriptive values for the, to meet this UA value, which I'm not going to get into right now, but you might basically need to have an exterior insulation, or you might have to make your cavity bigger or something along those lines. So for those two conditions, right, large additions and large alterations, that's the code, which is a big change from previous codes. Again, this I pulled from the DOAR presentation. This is a great summary on the performance of where we are with codes these days. And you can see, this is, with time, but we are currently here, well, really here, but the base code is approximately HERS 52. So in a community where the stretch code or the specialized code have not been adopted, the new R-type buildings would have to reach a HERS of 52. Stretch code has two, right? It has the all electric and the mixed fuel. The all electric is, you get a little bit of a break with HERS 45, and the mixed fuel, you have to be a little higher performance with HERS 42. And then the opt-in code for residential, especially, multifamily, brings you down to passive house. This is a very much an estimate, because the way passive house models could be, I would just call it mid 30s, right? So it could be anywhere between 30 and 40, sort of is the ultimate HERS score. It depends on the building type. And so this is, and so that's where we are for the performance. It's a significant increase this time around. Increase in performance, reduction in HERS scores. Okay, and so last couple slides here, I wanted to highlight what the mass save incentives are, because they really do align with the codes, but they're not exactly the same. So first of all, a really important point is this first right here, that by law, and according to their new 3-year plan, the utilities, and therefore mass save, cannot incentivize any gas equipment, or I should say fossil fuel, any oil, gas, propane, anything. So come December 31st is the last time you can get paid any incentive. And the really important part to understand is there's no grandfathering in, right? So if you're working on a project that, is going to be completed in February, you will not qualify, and you have gas, you will not qualify for that incentive that you may have counted for. The new structure for incentives again, these are small units here, small buildings with 1 to 4 units. There are 3 pathways. There's sort of the base pathway, which you can see it must be all electric, heating, water, cooking, and clothes drying. You have to be all electric. Some savings, you have a little bit of incentives here. Incentives, here is the Energy Star Next Gen is the next level up, and then Passive House. The thing about the Passive House incentive is that Passive House does allow you to have mixed fuel. So it's a little bit of a loop, that loophole where you can certify as a passive house, and you can have some kind of a gas fired, and you are still qualified for these incentives. Similar to, this is probably what we are most familiar with. The same idea here. We have, for a base incentive, which is, 1,500 per unit, as you can see here, you have to be all electric. Same with Energy Star. And then for passive house, these incentives have increased. They used to be $3,000. Now they're $3,750. And that's in addition to the $5,000 feasibility study and the modeling costs up to $20,000 per project. And notice that these, even if you're not planning to do passive house, you can still get paid, get the feasibility study for free, and get significant energy modeling cost offset with your project. So, in a specialized opt-in code, this is your pathway. You don't have a choice about it. In some of the other ones, you do have other options to follow, but they are much stricter on the all-electric component. And so, sort of try to bring it all together as much as I can. What really is going on with the codes in Massachusetts, energy codes right now, right? Huge focus on electrification. And reason for that is that it's one of the easiest, and I use that term very loosely, paths to decarbonization. And that could be a whole another presentation on that, but essentially the idea is we'll clean up the grid by 2050, so let's start prepping for when the grid is clean. So focus on heating, cooling, and ventilation in electrified domestic hot water, specific requirements for electric vehicle charging, and there are solar PV requirements as well. As far as certifications, Energy Star used to be an option. You could actually use the Energy Star certification as a pathway. That has been eliminated. There is no Energy Star option. Passive House is required for multifamily and opt-in communities, but can be used in any. You can still do Passive House as a compliance pathway in your, base code or stretch code. And then the HERS index has been tightened pretty significantly. That's a very significant reduction. And finally, new homes over 4,000 must be all electric. So this is, again, this single family sort of stuff. And then mixed fuel homes must be pre-wired for electrification, which is a big difference. The pre-wired means that you literally have to have all the wiring in place except for the appliance, right? So if you have a gas stove, behind that gas stove, you're going to have your 240-volt plug that's already wired to the panel, so that when you replace it in the future, you can do that and multiply that by every appliance in the house or the unit, right? Everything has to be able to be easily electrified as we move forward. So that's it on this. Hopefully this is I know there's a lot of information. I'm happy to take any comments. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I have a conversation. I'm happy to do that as well. But I'm gonna open it up to any questions. Let me know.
Thank you, Maciej. This is great. And I think Zoe had a question about the Passive House incentives from Mass Save. And could you talk a little bit more about whether if you have domestic hot water, gas powered, if it would be still eligible? I think you mentioned that loophole there.
My understanding is that yes, this is a plan that actually hasn't even come out officially. This July 1st, when this comes out. So, when it comes out, I'll be able to know 100%. But my understanding is yes, that if you certify the building as Passive House, the incentive, this 3,750, is based on the Passive House certification, regardless of your systems. So if you do want a domestic hot water, gas-fired system, you will be allowed to do that. But again, I would do put an asterisk next to my answer that until the final incentive structure comes out, I'm not 100% on that. But really, I'll take 2 seconds here to really just say that at this point, there's very little reason to stick with gas. There are some very good domestic hot water systems out there that are meant for our climate. And some of them are great because they're actually CO2 refrigerant based systems, and which is a huge benefit. It wasn't part of my it wasn't part of my core presentation, but I do have a couple of slides at the end, right? So CO2 refrigerants are really good because they have a global warming potential of 1, while heat pumps sort of with R410A or some other refrigerants, they're very much, 1 unit of that refrigerant is equal to 1,400 CO2 units, so equivalent. So there are many systems now on the market that are commercially viable for multifamily buildings that are heat pump systems, and they're not just the ones that are unitary with your heat, tank and then a heat pump on top. They're central site systems, individual systems, many options these days. So, yeah, so that's my understanding of the passive house incentives.
That's great. Thank you, Mache. And Zoe, if there's any follow-up on that, would be interested to understand if you would consider some of those, the all-electric DHW systems, or if it doesn't make sense for this project, but happy to hear more if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, it was one of those decisions we made like during the VE process, like a year and a half ago, where it was a significant cost savings to go to gas. It was like 7 figures at the time, but I know the technology is changing, and now we're in, obviously 100% CDs and trying to close and start construction. So it's just the timing was not ideal. The other thing I was just wondering is, there's been that big lawsuit or the in California about the electric, these energy codes requiring all electric buildings. Is that is that sort of changing any of the thinking? I don't know that you're hearing around the world. I've just been curious about how that California case could impact some of the state requirements with the new energy code.
Yeah. So my high level understanding is that really that California case was about prohibiting gas connection, not requiring all electric. So I think our situation is different from that respect. But yeah, I guess I would leave it at that. That's where my level of knowledge is, where I feel confident answering that question. But I see Lauren Bauman is on. She might know more about that. But so feel free, please, to jump in. But that's my level of understanding of that one.
And Mache, Bernetta was wondering if the passive house feasibility study funding incentive is available to single family. Did you have that in the slide previous?
The answer is no. No. The single family is based on these numbers right here. You get a lump sum at the end for certification. So for single family home, if you certify as passive house, at the end you will get a $25,000 check from SSAFE. Or if you have a 4-unit building, you get a $40,000 check, and so on. So that there's no breakdown in that incentive structure.
Thank you. And just Mache, just to clarify, these mass save incentives are the ones that are being proposed for the 2025 to 2027 period. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Great. Do other folks have questions for Mache? You can come off mute or raise your hand or throw it in the chat. This is a lot of great information. Jen, I see you came on video. Did you have a question? Wendy has a question. Is there an effort to provide passive house incentives in non-mass save communities?
Like in municipal lighting plants.
Yes.
I don't think so. I think the incentives are, the Cape Light Compact has its own, but they're really based on mass save. But all the municipal lighting plants are on their own. So even though some of these codes are now applicable to them, I don't believe that those same incentives work in those 40 or so communities that have lighting plants.
Do others have questions?
One quick question that I had. Do you know if there are any incentives for providing like battery storage, on-site storage of energy? Has that come in at all?
There are incentives not through mass save, but there are incentives through the federal tax credits. So I believe that now the IRA allows for direct payment to nonprofits and communities with entities with no tax burden. And so I think in addition to that 30% ITC that there are adders that you can have for battery storage and for for battery storage specifically to your question. Additionally, the SMART program, which is on the Massachusetts side, also has adders for battery storage. So while there's no mass save incentives that I'm aware of, there are a lot of federal programs at this point that do subsidize that. And I would just a quick sort of plug, somewhat unrelated, is that ground source heat pump now qualifies for the ITC. So if you're looking at heating and cooling, it's the single most efficient system that we have, and really this tax incentive, the ITC of 30% really equalizes the first cost of ground source heat pump with anything else that's out there, including heat VRF systems and gas fire systems. So I think if you're at planning stages or so, I think you should seriously look at ground source heat pump systems because of this tax incentives that came through the IRA.
Thank you, Maciej. That's a great point. And some of our energy cohort members, including Boston Housing Authority and Valley CDC, are installing ground source heat pumps. So feel free to reach out to me if you are interested thinking about that for some of your projects, and we can connect you with those folks. And then Lauren just added, I think for Wendy's benefit, that DOER is looking to use some of their DOE rebates to help supplement the municipal light plant work. So that, be on the lookout for that probably later this year. Are there other questions or comments on the building energy code?
I guess another follow-up question, if I may.
Sure.
Does like a generator fall into some sort of exemption if it's natural gas or propane fired? Like how does that kind of come into play as like a backup for, resilience and sustainability for these communities and buildings, I guess?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, it does. It's an exempted. I think I would invite people to explore the battery storage as a backup, but yes, the gas-fired generators used for life safety and backup generation are exempted from this no gas rule.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, we're definitely on the front end of battery storage as a backup generation, but we have some front runners like POA and Julie Klump, one of our energy cohort members, who have been pushing the envelope on that. So we can share more as that gets to fruition.
We recently completed a project in Lexington, their police station, and they are not only on a battery storage backup, but they are also islandable, so they're able to recharge the storage with the solar panels when the grid is down, which is long time has been a no-no, but they're allowed to do that. So there are examples out there. I wouldn't say that I'm looking forward to proliferation of that technique, but it's not quite there yet.
Well, Maciej, thank you so much for sharing this really timely and wealth of information. We're really appreciative, and we'll share recording and slides with this group. And please feel free to follow up with Maciej, who is an expert on the building code. And yes, a plug for the domestic hot water electrification. Maciej, maybe we may take you up on your offer of getting some of those specs on some of the systems that folks might want to consider for some of their upcoming projects. So thank you all. And now I think what we'll do is turn over, I see Bob LaRocca here. And so we're going to turn it over to Bob, I think, to give a clean energy tax credit presentation to the group, about 15 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A for a few minutes and we'll adjourn around 12:15. And if folks need to drop off at noon, we'll have the recording. Bob, is it okay if we continue the recording? Okay. So
Absolutely.
we can share the slides and recording if folks have to drop off a little early. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bob to share about clean energy tax credits for nonprofits. And thank you, Mache, again.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm Bob LaRocca, Deputy Director of Federal Funds and Infrastructure for the state. I'm just going to share my screen here.
Hi, Bob. This is Don. I need to make you a co-host. Give me one second
okay.
here. You can
Sure.
do that. Should be all set.
Okay. So let me share my screen here. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. Okay, well, thanks everybody. I'm excited to be here to talk about a really exciting opportunity called the Direct Pay Program. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this is really the work that we are doing as a state is really a collaborative effort among agencies, among different offices. So we're working among, the administration and finance agency, our office, Federal Funds and Infrastructure, as well as the governor's office of Climate Innovation and Resilience. Before I get into it, so that people have an understanding, the Federal Funds and Infrastructure Office was created by executive order by Governor Healy last fall. And our job is just simply put to go out and help find federal dollars and bring them back to the state and to advocate for those interests and also to communicate good information on how federal dollars can be leveraged. And so hence, we've been doing a lot of work around direct pay, this really exciting program through the Inflation Reduction Act that I will give an overview on. So I'll talk just briefly about what is direct pay. I'll talk about what are some applicable credits. I'll talk a little bit about the credit amounts and bonuses. I'll give you all a sense of timeline for this because timeline's actually, the process of trying to capture these credits is, it's intricate and there's a lot to it. So I'll try to spell some of that out. And then we have also been collecting and disseminating helpful resources that I will point you to as well. Quick disclaimer, I'm a lawyer by trade, but I am not acting in a legal capacity on this call. I am not an accountant. So the information here is purely informational only. We advise that if you are going to dig in on these, that you do contact an attorney or an accountant for that support and service. Okay, I swear this is the only slide with a lot of text on it, but I'll go through what is direct pay. So the Inflation Reduction Act passed under the Biden administration. It makes the largest clean energy investment in US history. I think a lot of people might know that, but what I don't think is very well understood is that a big bulk of that investment actually comes through in tax incentives. And that's really where direct pay comes into the picture. There are, to be clear, discretionary grants and formula funding that kind of pump out of DC to states and to other entities through IRA or because of IRA, but a lot of this it's really a tax bill. So under the IRA, tax exempt and governmental entities, so this includes cities and towns, it includes the Commonwealth, so the state, but also nonprofits such as yourselves that do not owe federal taxes are for the first time able to receive payment equal to the full value of tax credits for either building qualifying clean energy projects or making qualifying investments. And this is what is called the direct pay program. Another way to put this is you file a return with the IRS and you can receive a cash refund for these projects. The program's unique in that, it applies to qualifying projects put into service from January 1st, 2023, all the way up to December 31st, 2032. So this is really we like to say it's a decade of tax opportunity. And then I've bolded here, our office works a lot in the competitive grant space, so we help provide support around applications when new notices come out about different applications or different programs, we share that information. What's great about direct pay is that unlike competitive grant programs, there's no limit. There's literally no limit to how much you or we or any governmental non-taxed entity can leverage this opportunity. So I will go through, so I think that makes it very exciting, and especially over a 10-year period, it's a unique program coming out. Okay, so what are we doing as a state? Just to give you all a little bit of context. So the first thing is we are working on the state side to try to understand and execute the filing for our own 2023 projects. That's the first bucket. The second bucket is really what I'm doing here and what we've been working to do for a little while now and will continue, is to provide some good actionable guidance to cities, towns, and to tax exempt entities about what this is and what are some helpful next steps. Though that's really where we're at with these first two buckets. 3 and 4 here, we really want to begin to start strategizing about how you can use these tax credits in the future going forward. So like really baking, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but like actually baking these tax realization into your capital planning if you're a town or your project building, if you're a nonprofit, or your budgets, right? And then fourth, we are hopefully going to have some good news on legislation related to this, but we are working to think really creatively about providing bridge lending and different kinds of financing mechanisms, specifically for some startup costs around these capital projects. So there are about a dozen credits, and I say about because there's some name changes there, but there's really 4 that are most relevant to municipalities and to tax exempt entities. So this includes cities and towns creating alternative refueling property, so EV structures, conversion of fleets to electric vehicles. But then probably what's most relevant for you all is 45 and 48 here, so the green and the gray. So there is a production tax credit where you actually will get credit for kilowatt hours of energy produced. And then also section 48 is an energy investment tax credit, which is, I think as Mashe said, if you were to install geothermal heat pumps, or if you put solar panels on rooftops of your buildings, you would be eligible to qualify for those as well. So credit amounts. The most common one is really this investment tax credit, and the basis credit for that is 6%. I'll get into how it gets up to 30, and in some cases more than that in a moment. But just a quick note here, there's up to $7,500 for a light vehicle and up to $40,000 for conversion of a larger vehicle, about 14,000 pounds there. Okay. So I mentioned that if you leverage this investment tax credit, you get the automatic basis of 6% of your overall project cost back, right? But good stuff. There's a lot of bonuses that can be accessed. And so actually what I think I'd like to do is just point you to the third column here. So this prevailing wage and apprenticeship. So if you're using labor according to prevailing wage and apprenticeship standards, you would be eligible for a 5 times bonus. That would get you up to 30. I should say here that I believe if you're doing certain projects that are not producing a certain amount of energy, you automatically get that 30%, but it's a little bit complicated, and we advise people to on some of these details, dig in. I was not, Mashe mentioned battery storage. I'm not 100% sure of that. However, there is a 10% bonus if you're using applicable US made domestic content materials. And these would apply to both the production tax credit and the more common investment tax credit. Okay, so how might this actually work? Okay, so I give this example here. Let's say you're a municipality, you have brownfield status, you're installing a microgrid, you would be eligible for section 48. And the project cost, just using a round number here, $2 million. Just to give you a sense of like how potentially transformative this is on a variety of projects, whether you're a nonprofit, a city, town, or the state. In this specific example, yeah, you'd have to pay the $2 million cost, but you would recoup as a town 40% of the project in tax credits because of the bonuses, right? So it is really a way that can transform how we think about building clean energy projects and our investment planning, or I should say capital planning. Okay, so this is a rough process timeline. There's a couple of extra elements to this. I will try to cover it as simply as I can. The IRA gives applicants the ability to choose, and this is really the first arrow here, their initial filing date. So what does that mean? You can either file by calendar year or by a fiscal year. If you're going to try to get a project that was placed into service from the beginning of 2023, you would need to, in that case, file by calendar year. So that's the example that we've set up here. You could file by fiscal year, and then you'd get kind of, along a different timeline, but you'd miss that first half of 2023. So we kind of go through the process according to this timeline. So that's the first thing. You need to decide which calendar, how you're going to file. Then, consult counsel, consult tax advisors. You want to start. We're in a period now where identifying these qualifying projects, gathering the necessary information. We have resources on our website that can help, you figure out, oh my gosh, like what kinds of information do I need here? We have some supportive materials there. The IRS is giving all applicants an automatic 6-month extension. So normally, if you're filing by a calendar year, you would have to file by May 15th. However, they're giving you an automatic 6-month extension because of this program. And then they require that you pre-register with the IRS for any of the projects that you want to include in that filing about 120 days before. So if you're looking at this timeline here, by July 15th, so in about a month, you would need to pre-register with the IRS that lists that qualifying project, that says which credit you're applying for, and has all the necessary information. And then November 15th, you would have to actually file with the IRS. I should say for a while, we were seeking a lot of guidance on this. We weren't sure if the 120-day before was a hard and fast deadline or if it's just recommended. The IRS did come out with guidance recently saying that that's the recommended date. So, if you can't get it in, you can't register with the IRS until, say, July 17th. We don't believe that would affect your ability to effectively file by the end of the year. Okay, so next steps. I'll just go through this pretty quickly. I mentioned in the beginning, like that third bucket of beginning to think, okay, I, as a nonprofit, have some ideas about projects I want to do, or there's clean energy projects on our horizon, really building, I guess, a mini team or some sort of advisory group or a working group to try to come up with a plan for that, try to understand. And again, this presentation we typically do for cities and towns, but it applies to everybody. Trying to understand what your needs might be over the next decade. So in including those tax value and trying to bake that into any kind of real estate planning, or, in the case of cities and towns, some vehicle fleet planning. We've gotten some feedback saying that, people, they should really kind of work in close connection with architects, designers, facility managers, so that everybody's aware of these opportunities. And then, make a plan for how you would receive your share of refunds over the next decade. This last point, number 3, I think applies a little more to cities and towns, because they would be getting a check back from the IRS. And there's some question about, well, does that just go to our general fund, or can we put it in something else that can be leveraged for other clean energy projects? Municipalities would need to sort that out on their own. But basically, we're trying to tell folks, get in what you can for 2023, but we're already halfway through 2024. So beginning to think about, how this, yes, it lasts through to 2032, but, put this into your planning in the years going forward. And then we have a bunch of resources here. I'll just direct you to the top bullet point here. Our Federal Funds and Infrastructure Office has put together a bunch of the resources here and then extra ones, and we updated over time that can help you to figure out how to go forward with this really, really exciting opportunity. So with that, I think I've come in under the 15-minute mark. I am really happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
Thank you, Bob. This is fantastic. And yeah, does anyone have any questions on the clean energy tax credits?
Thank you for putting that together. I have a quick question that might be very specific, and it's sorry, 1 second.
While Mache is doing that, I'll just, go ahead, Mache.
Sorry. The adder for tax for the 20% bonus for the solar, for affordable housing. I'm wondering
Yes.
if you have any. We went through this for a client, and it turned out that there's this requirement that says that the benefit of the solar has to go directly to the tenants, which is very difficult to do on some of these projects. Can you just speak to that a little bit and maybe confirm or deny that that's true, what your understanding is?
I hate to do this very annoying thing, which is just to give the disclaimer that this is not legal or tax advice. But as I understand it, Maje, that is not something that I have heard. The actual critical components here are that to receive the credit, it's really, there's more than two things, but to simplify it, the applicant has to actually own the asset, right? And then secondly, it has to be placed into service in the year that you are seeking to get the credit. I have not heard anything about who benefits from the clean energy production. I will say, though, that I believe that 20% bonus, I'm not 100% sure I believe it applies to a community that is building a affordable housing. So I don't know. I don't believe it would be the developer that would be able to access that 20% bump. I should say these direct pay tax credits have been around for a while now, actually. They've just been available to private citizens and to developers. And there are some rules that just frankly, for obvious reasons, we're not as in touch on. But I hope I answered your question. I don't think that it requires that folks living inside the affordable housing unit actually receive the clean energy production, although I'm not sure how they wouldn't in that circumstance.
You are required to submit a benefit sharing agreement with your application. So that is correct, but there are ways, I haven't done it yet, but I hear that there are ways that you can make other things in your operations count as long as they equal the benefit from the solar. So for example, if you have resident services, you can show that it's an equal amount to the benefit of the solar, that can go in your benefit sharing agreement.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I can confirm that. I did that on my project. We received I think a 40% refund, or I forget what we're using, total. And as part of that, we submitted a letter basically saying that I think it's either resident services or I think heating and cooling around the house meter. So one of those was construed as a tenant benefit, which allowed us to claim the additional credit.
Thank you. That's great to know. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sean, and thanks, Chrissy. And just to lift up that in the Star Solar program, Resident Energy, they're not CPAs, but they can provide support on the coaching our participants through those mechanics and doing pre-applications and other gathering supporting documentation. Sean, I don't know if you maybe took advantage of that as part of your application.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, support is probably underselling it. They basically drafted a letter, which we signed. I mean, we provided the details as to some of the financials, but yeah, they sort of ran us through that process.
Great.
I
Sorry, go
No,
for it.
I was just, I should add, on our deck, Lawyers for Good Government has a lot of helpful information. They actually have some of these forms annotated so that you can see, okay, this is what I gotta put in for this information, and we have that all on our website, and it's in this slide deck. So, chances are they're also very responsive if you're seeking some limited free legal advice. So.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Any other questions for Bob?
I'd like to just add one thing. I think that as we go forward with this and we start in the fall, as we get through this 2023 process, we are going to continue to be doing a lot of engagement across the state. And we and the Climate Office would love to, if there's anybody that wants to share their story of this experience, to really make it concrete for folks maybe in smaller towns that want to do this kind of, leverage this opportunity. We welcome that kind of like communications partnership, because I think it's one thing for me to give you the overview. It's a lot different to hear from somebody that, has going through the process on their own and kind of experiencing what's easy, what's hard, what's in between. We get a lot of questions around, well, when does the money come back to us? And, we've been told it can be up to 12 months, but we've also heard that it can be as early as 2 or 3 months. So I think it varies. I imagine that with the first time around, I guess time and a half around this coming fall, there might be a little bit more of a backlog. But we'd love to continue a conversation here just to share the experiences of folks that are seeking the credits.
That's great, Bob. Yeah, we can definitely, our 500 energy cohort members are probably happy to share their experiences to date. So yeah, let's definitely plan on that.
Great.
Great. Well, I know we're almost at time. Thank you to both of our presenters for terrific information, and we'll make sure that the whole group gets these, and we'll share emails if there's follow-up questions as well. Are there any announcements that folks have for the group? I don't have any offhand, and Dawn, if there are any on your end, please feel free to shout them out. We've solved everything. So I think, I don't think we have anything planned yet in the hopper for energy cohort for July or August. But we are definitely welcoming folks to reach out to us as there are additional topics. It maybe sounds like there might be DHW, all electric domestic hot water, tech specs update that we might want to do. But if there's other topics, please just ping LISC, MACDC, New Ecology, and we'll definitely would love to consider them. And so in the meantime, I hope everyone has a lovely rest of your week, and yeah, happy almost summer.